Hello, fifth graders. Thank you for coming to watch this notes video about the French and Indian War, also called the 7 Years' War, and I'll explain why it has two names in a second here. Um, France and Great Britain were enemies, especially during this time period. They wanted to control the world, and they wanted to control as much land in the world as they could. And the term empire refers to all the land a country owns. So both France and Great Britain wanted to have huge empires. So that meant they needed to have more land. So a lot of their fighting during this time period is coming down to that idea of owning land. Um, Fighting between France and Britain had taken place all over the world, and the fighting in North America was the fourth in a series of four wars. Between 1689 and 1763, the two world powers had fought in Europe, India, the Caribbean, and North America. So they had been fighting each other for a long time throughout the world. And in North America, the French were here first, then the English came, but that didn't stop the English from wanting more land. I should say British at this point. Great Britain and France started fighting in 1754 for control of North America. Now, the reason it's called the 7 Years' War is even though fighting started in 1754 in North America, 2 years later, in 1756, the two sides would start fighting each other back in Europe. And it lasted 7 years. So in Europe, they fought for 7 years. That's why they call it the 7 Years' War. It's called the French and Indian War because that's the name the colonists gave it. Because during the war, the colonists were fighting the French and their allies, many different Native American groups. So that's why it has two different names to it. 7 Years' War, because that's how long Great Britain and France fought each other over in Europe. And the French and Indian War, because that's the name the colonists gave it, because they were fighting the French and their Native American allies. And you see right here in the green, even though the war lasted 9 years in North America, it was named the 7 Years' War because fighting between the British and French took place in Europe from 1756 to 1763. So down, going to the next part of the notes, most colonists were Protestants, and who rushed to join the war. Protestants were not big fans of Catholics, and a lot of French people were Catholics. And so Protestants and Catholics did not get along, and they're both Christian groups, but they just didn't like each other because of religions. And the big thing that started the fighting was this in purple here. Colonists also disliked the French because they had forts in Canada and along the Ohio River that prevented the colonists from moving west. So as more people are coming to the colonies, they need more land. And the only way they could get that is by moving west. Well, the British colonists couldn't move west because the French were there. And they needed them out of there. They wanted that land. So when it came time to fighting, very few of the colonists had military experience. Therefore, they looked up to the British regulars. So those British soldiers that were full-time, that was their job. And Great Britain had one of the best armies in the world. The soldiers were great, had the best supplies available at the time, the best muskets, their guns. So they had the big advantage. And if we go back a little bit, we talked about that idea of solitary neglect. And that's where King George and the British Parliament started to ignore the colonies, didn't worry about taxes, because they knew this war was coming. And they wanted the colonists to be happy and with Great Britain and fight on their side. During the war, poor food made soldiers more likely to get sick. There was often very little food for soldiers to eat, especially the colonial soldiers, the soldiers that were fighting for the colonists that were fighting. Because Great Britain was really more focused on keeping their own soldiers fed. They didn't really worry so much about the soldiers that were from the colonies. Camps where the soldiers stayed were very crowded, and diseases like typhoid fever spread quickly. During the 7 Years' War, more soldiers died from disease than from actual fighting. And that's often the case through a lot of these wars during this time period. Disease is going to kill a lot of them. More soldiers, I just read there, more soldiers will die from these diseases than actual fighting, so getting shot and other things in battle. And that's just because where they stayed, they're so close together that disease spreads quickly. And they didn't have the medical advances like we do today. A lot of Native American tribes in the war. At the start of the war, one large Native American group up by the New York area was the Iroquois. They wanted to stay out of it. Then they carefully studied politics and realized they could use that to help them. So, working with one group, then go and work with another group. So they did that. Sometimes they supported the British and sometimes the French. They didn't want either side to win and become more powerful in North America. The Huron and Seneca and other Native American groups fought with the French. The Seneca were also part of the Iroquois Nation, which we learned about earlier this year. Early in the war, several Native American groups helped the French defeat the British. This caused the king and parliament to send more troops and better food and guns. And that goes back to when the colonists were worried they were going to lose, so they asked Great Britain to spend more money on the war. And that's where William Pitt stepped in and said, all right, we're going to spend more money, we'll get more troops, we'll get more supplies. And that was a large turning point in the war. And the Iroquois saw that. They said, oh, the British are starting to invest more in this war. And they realized, okay, the British are going to win, we need to start helping them. So they switched sides. Not all Native American groups did that, but a good number of them did. So now with better supplies and more troops, the British began to win more battles. So remember, a war is not just one nonstop battle, just fighting all the time. There's several different battles that take place over the course of the war. The British began to win more battles. One such battle occurred in Quebec, the capital of French Canada. So the British decided we need to focus on Canada. That's where a lot of French soldiers are up along the St. Lawrence River. And so they changed their strategy a little bit. So we look talking about the French up in Canada. We're talking about this area right up here. I don't know if it'll let me zoom in. So right up in here, the French have all this blue. And the British decide we have to focus up on Canada. And they're going to do that by starting with Quebec right here. And Quebec is right on the St. Lawrence River, which has access to the Atlantic Ocean. And the French had a fort up there. And it sat on a cliff. And that's a big advantage to have your fort up on a cliff because you can see the enemy coming and it's harder for the enemy to attack up the hill. So as I just said here, Quebec sat atop a cliff and attacking was very dangerous for the British. In the middle of the night, British soldiers secretly climbed a narrow path up the cliff. But prior to that, the British had put Quebec under siege. And that term siege means you completely surround an area, whether it's a fort, a city, and nothing gets in or out. And eventually the people inside will have to either starve to death, they run out of supplies, and they might have to surrender at some point. So after they had done that for months, the British did that. They snuck up the hill, and when the French woke up, discovered the British, and fighting soon began. The British soldiers were more experienced, and the fighting only lasted, it says 15 to 30 minutes, but it's closer to 15 to 20 before the French surrendered. And the British now controlled the key to power over most of North America. Because looking at this map, they had control of who can go up and down this St. Lawrence River. So that was a big loss for the French. And then a little bit later, the British would move from Quebec to Montreal right here and defeat the British. And the British defeated the French at Montreal. And that was basically the end of the war. The French just could not continue fighting after that. So near the end of 1762, they started to meet to figure out a treaty to end the war. So a treaty is a written document saying, okay, both sides agree to these things. So eventually in 1763, Great Britain and France signed the Treaty of Paris 1763 that ended all fighting. It's important to remember that year, Treaty of Paris 1763, because then 20 years later, there'll be another Treaty of Paris. So as part of the treaty agreement, when they were doing all this talking, at first Great Britain wanted all French land in North America, but the French didn't want them to get too powerful. So the French did not want them to have total control of this entire continent. I'm going to see if I can zoom out. So they didn't want them to have total control. They were worried they'd get too powerful. So therefore, Britain got French land east of the Mississippi River, and Spain got French land west of the Mississippi River, even though the Spanish had helped France. So now you have Great Britain, who goes from this color right here. Now they're going all the way to the Mississippi River. So France is gone. They're allowed to keep a few islands here and down here. But now Great Britain is here, and Spain is here. And Spain also gave up Florida. A few things I want to talk about the results of the French and Indian War. The Proclamation of 1763. So a proclamation is you're making an announcement, a rule, some sort of statement, and this announcement came in 1763. That's why we call it the Proclamation of 1763. It declared that all land west of the Appalachian Mountains was safe for the Native Americans. So the colonists could no longer move past that mountain range. They had to stop because Great Britain did not want to spend money on protecting the colonists from the Native Americans that might attack. Well, the colonists, they were very angry. They're like, we helped you win this war so we could move and get that land, use that land. We need the land. The French were there. That kept us from going there. But now you're keeping us from going there. And so a lot of the colonists are like, why did we help you win this war? What was the purpose of us helping you? So there were some costs of victory, so some negative things that happened because of Great Britain winning the war. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, created the Proclamation of 1763, which we already talked about and how it angered the colonists. Britain had borrowed a lot of money to fight the war and had to pay it back. They were in debt. They owed a lot of money from this war. And they're going to have to find a way to get that money back. And the way they're going to do it is by taxing the colonists, trying to get more money from the colonists. Britain now had to pay 3 times as much for soldiers and sailors to protect the colonies. They had more land in North America. And when you have more land, you need more soldiers, more sailors to protect that land. So that's going to be expensive. A lot of Native American tribes lost power because their French allies were gone. And even though some tried to fight back against the British, they just really didn't have the ability to. And many colonial men died fighting in the war, creating widows. So widows are people, women whose husbands have died, and orphans. So sometimes you might now have kids without parents because their parents died in the war. Because of the war, the views are starting to change for some of the colonists. Some of them felt they no longer needed the British to protect them from the French. So they start thinking, why do we need the British? The French are gone. We don't need protection from anybody anymore. Maybe we don't need Great Britain as much. And many colonists had learned how to fight during the war and felt they didn't need the British to help them defend themselves anymore. So they're really starting to separate from Great Britain. And a lot of them are starting to see themselves more as Americans versus British. So some of their attitudes are starting to change. And the big thing is, a lot of people are going to start asking, do we really need to be part of Great Britain? So thanks for watching. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.